expertise for a longer period. We were trying to convince her today to go to Kayaşehir for her to get a sense of the wider community of the inhabitants here. Yeah, I think she discovered maybe people she could work with.
Yes, of course. Of course.
Stuff with, so we're very happy to have her. We're also looking forward to this now very topical topic of Nadia Murad.
Yes.
Explaining she just won the Nobel Prize.
You stole my thunder.
I know!
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. And so I'll just go through this, hopefully not taking up too much time. So for a while I've been thinking about the whole question of rape as a weapon of war. And this goes back to the early 90s when I was in Croatia and Ljubljana in Slovenia and meeting with some of the women who had had horrible experiences at the hands of the Serbs. So today I'm going to start off by addressing the representation of rape and conflict with a focus on Daesh. Do you all use the term Daesh?
Yes.
So with a focus on Daesh, perpetrators of sexual violence, their Yazidi victims, and the women's demands for reparative, restorative justice. Held in sexual slavery between 2014 and 2015, Farida Khalaf and Nadia Murad published memoirs that detail their experiences in Iraqi and Syrian sex camps. Adjudicated a crime against humanity at the end of the 20th century, rape as a weapon of war no longer slips under the radar of international attention. This talk today will argue that the Yazidi women's brave decision to speak out may play a crucial role in breaking the silence about rape as a weapon of war and genocide. So, part of wars since antiquity, military rape has not only been tolerated, but sometimes also celebrated in works of art. An early example comes from the 8th century BCE when Romulus founded Rome. It was a city of men. Realizing that without women, Rome could not survive, the young leader invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival and ordered his soldiers to abduct the women. Male artists across the ages have glorified these men's actions. In the 16th century, here you have 16th century Gian Bologna's abduction of the Sabine women. So we have this three-tiered statue, of course, with the...
Where's the statue?
I think it's in the, in Florence, the Uffizi. I think it's in the Uffizi. So always the rapist very muscled. So I'm just going to show you a couple more. Here we have Nicolas Poussin's version of the rape of the Sabine women. And notice again, you know, the white of the marble of the Bologna statue, I think, is really interesting. Obviously, they all are, but it's very much about the women having marble white skin. Now, you can see that Romulus has opened his cloak, and this was apparently a sign that the rape could start. So, the next one, I just thought that I would show you three images from the same rape of the Sabine women. So in the 18th century, we have Sebastiano Ricci with his version of women being raped by brawny men. In pre-Islamic Arabia, rape was an accepted part of war. Bride abduction, rasp, was celebrated in poetry as a heroic practice with economic gain. It was not only she who was stolen, writes Hina Azam. It was not only the woman who was stolen, but the wealth that she could have commanded. 6th century Arabian poet Hatim bin Abdallah bin Sa'ad al-Tai celebrated his tribe's rape of enemy women. They did not give us, the men of Tai, their daughters in marriage, but rather we wooed them against their will with our swords.
The women or the tribe?
No, it's against the women's will. To be a little iconoclastic about Imr al-Qais, and I know that you're going to be doing something on Imr al-Qais. Imr al-Qais was really raping some of those women.
Who?
Imr al-Qais. And he's very proud of the fact that he's raping, the mother, and she's just had a baby, and she's suckling the child, and he comes in. And he talks about the fact that he has to violently possess her. Historically absent from wartime rape stories have been the voices of women. And this didn't change until after World War II. Celebration of sexual coercion in war was giving way to disgust, as we can see in this canvas that forms part of the Horrors of War series by Joseph Shepard. Ragged soldiers, their uniform pants down around their ankles, are as humiliated in this image as the women they have just raped. There is nothing heroic about this representation of Russians violating German women refugees. After World War II, rape as a weapon of war, if not yet of genocide, grabbed some headlines. The silence of survivors began to break in 1991. A few surviving Korean comfort women, after 50 years of shame and silence about the sexual torture they suffered at the hands of the Japanese military, called for reparations and an apology from the Japanese government, and the world began to pay attention. 2 years later, 1993, Serb camps holding Bosnian Muslim women in sexual slavery were discovered, globally denounced, and incorrectly declared to be unprecedented. And there followed news of other rape camps in Libya, South Sudan, Nigeria, Kosovo, Congo. But the worst reports came from Rwanda, where the Hutu majority was conducting genocide against the Tutsi minority. Almost 500,000 women were said to have been raped, and almost 1 million Tutsis were killed. In 1994, the UN created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR. And after trying about 20,000 criminals, the ICTR called the widespread rapes a weapon of genocide. This is a really important move, right? So we have it moving from a weapon of war to a weapon of genocide. The ICTI, so this is the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia, followed the lead of the Rwanda. On June the 28th, 1996, the New York Times published a report that the Yugoslav International Criminal Tribunal had, and I quote, indicted 8 Bosnian Serb military and police officers in connection with rapes of Muslim women in the Bosnian War, marking the first time that sexual assault has been treated separately as a crime of war. Now that is very important because before, well, you could be a criminal and you could have killed, or you could, many crimes, and they all fell together as a weapon of war. But in this situation, what we have is separately, on its own, it's a crime of war. Key in this announcement, as in the outcome of the ICTR trials, was delinking rape from other war crimes and specifically demanding its prosecution at the highest levels. Optimism, however, was premature. No one had anticipated Daesh. In 2014, Daesh surfaced as an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Its brutality included public beheadings and the pseudo-religious authorization of rape as a weapon of genocide. Daesh functioned for 3 years as an internationally recognized state with its capital in Syrian Raqqa, an army, a police force, an intelligence service, a national anthem and flag, but also, remarkably, a research and fatwas department. I will be talking more about this in a bit. But they also had the Khansa Brigade. This brigade was appointed to make sure that the women within Daesh, so we're not talking about war captives, but the women who joined Daesh as wives, because immediately they would become involved in jihad and nikah, which many people refer to as sex jihad. But once the women were in Raqqa, they had to obey the draconian rules of Daesh. And if they didn't, then the Khansa brigades were the ones who were going to follow up. There's been some discussion about this image, obviously it's very posed. But some of these images are very important in circulating the terror of a movement that uses women with Kalashnikovs. So in August 2014, the abduction of Yazidi women from Sinjar shocked the world. After capturing and torturing about 5,000 Yazidi women and children, the fighters bragged of their heroism. But members of the Research and Fatwas Department were a little concerned about this. Apparently, they thought that this time the brothers had gone too far. And so they dug deep into history to confirm the appropriateness of their rules and regulations. So obviously what they decided was that since the Yazidis were heterodox, devil worshippers, they were those who had been targeted and, they could be targeted again. So obviously they had targeted this particular group. In late December 2015, the international media reported that Daesh had issued Fatwa 64, regulating sexual relations between fighters and sabaya, or female war captives. The Daesh Research and Fatwas Committee confused Quranic language about women's rights in marriage with men's rights to rape. They made rape of sabaya a religious duty with strict guidelines about what is permitted and what is forbidden. So I'll just show you, I wasn't able to find the Arabic of Fatwa 64, but you can begin to read here some of it. So it was issued in January of 2015, but the world only became aware of it in December. And I have an argument with a lot of commentators who've said, well, Daesh is only supporting or using the Quran's permissibility for men to have sexual relations with their concubines and therefore slaves. And my argument is that these are not slaves. The word in Arabic, sabiya, the plural sabaya, is very definitely war captives, and it refers to women war captives. By extension, it becomes a sex slave. But a sex slave is not a slave that becomes a concubine. So I have a long, complicated discussion about that, but that is why I think it's so important to pay attention to the fact that they are referring to the women always as sabaya. So while we have the language is Quranic, and if you read some of this, it sounds very much like the Mahram verses from Surah 4, ayahs 19 to 28. Thank you. Thank you. So Fatwa 64 enshrines what has been called a theology of rape. These articles about the Sabaya who cannot be raped disturbingly echo particularly verses 22 to 23 of Surah An-Nisa, the Mahram verses, that list women with whom a man has a blood or foster relationship that precludes contractual marriage or nikah. So in Quran 4:24, you can read that men have permission to marry, but our student Keisha Ali wrote an entire dissertation that was turned into a book about the significance of this moment, that yes, you marry, but actually the dowry is payment for access, sexual access to the woman's body. So men can have access, sexual access to a woman's body, provided that you seek them with your property, taking them in marriage, not committing fornication, so fahisha. A dowry must be paid for a marriage to be legitimate. Without it, the relationship constitutes the crime of fahisha, or fornication. Daesh men's familiarity with Quranic language would make Fatwa 64 not only reasonable, but religiously valid. So they're reported to pray before and after each rape. The rapist, I would say, has been conditioned to think of God before and after the violation. In its insertion between two embodied acts of spiritual veneration, the rape presumably acquires a spiritual aura, even more so when framed as a fatwa. Daesh theologians have used Islamic language to oppose the intent of Islamic law. They have masked theology as religion and then reverted to and reinstituted a pre-Islamic tribal practice that became a crime against God through Islamic codification of the moral framework of zina. They have woven pre-Islamic tribal threads from At-Taya that I read earlier. They've woven pre-Islamic tribal threads into the fabric of Quranic language in order to authorize men's rights of access to the bodies of women explicitly forbidden to them in the Quran. International scrutiny turned to Daesh on May the 7th, 2015, when Zainab Bangura, UN Special Envoy on Sexual Violence and Conflict, warned the UN that Daesh had, and I quote, institutionalized sexual violence and the brutalization of women as a central aspect of their ideology and operations, using it as a tactic of terrorism to advance their key strategic objectives. So this is even before the general international distribution of the text itself of Fatwa 64. So in May, we have Zainab Bangura urging the international community to make Daesh accountable for crimes against humanity. More than a year later, however, nothing had been done. In the silence of international action, 2 Yazidi women have become their own plaintiffs and advocates, knowing that they must tell their traumatic experiences for justice to be dealt. Farida Khalaf and Nadia Murad, who were kept as sex slaves and whose families were slaughtered, have spoken out. So I'll talk briefly about Farida Khalaf and then in greater detail about Nadia Murad. Farida Khalaf's 2016, The Girl Who Escaped ISIS, This Is My Story, takes the reader on her journey from Kochil, her village near Sinjar, to the holding pen in Raqqa, where with other girls she was daily offered to customers. A German journalist translates and arranges the autobiographical narrative, and her name is Hoffman. Hoffman writes at the end in a postface, although talking has turned her emotions, Farida Khalaf's emotions, it has triggered an inner process of clearing up. Now she starts to reorder and reassess her experiences. The girl who defeated ISIS is struggling to accept her horrific experiences as part of her past, and at the same time, to walk through life with her head held high. Thus ends this collaboratively produced tale of survival. So does it matter that it was collaboratively produced? Hoffman clearly seems to have had a very strong role in this autobiographical narrative. Clearly it does, because there has been, since the late 90s, quite a lot of discussion about these collaboratively produced autobiographies that record horrors. So Anna Douglas, in a 2003 article, is adamant that we have to pay attention to the collaborative nature of these productions. And in her analysis of the politics behind the 1983 collaboration between indigenous Guatemalan human rights activist, Quechua-speaking Rigoberta Menchu, and her Venezuelan translator-editor, Elizabeth Burgos de Bray, is urging caution when we read such mediated autobiographies or testimonials. Accessing the rarely recorded indigenous voice, and so clearly what I'm talking about today are the indigenous voice is a Yazidi version of Kurdish. So in some ways, that Kurdish is as inaccessible as Quechua is. So there is a need for a story like this to get out. It needs to get out in English or French or German, but primarily in English. So, me llamo Rigoberta Menchu y así me nació la conciencia. I, Rigoberta Menchu, that is how my conscience was born, or something like that. Is this collaboratively produced text between a woman who knows Spanish and a bit of Quechua, and I'm sure there's been another translator between them. So readers are under the impression that they're receiving an almost transparent account of the life and communities of indigenous peoples, generally from third world contexts, Douglas writes, whose lives and cultural fabrics are coming unraveled. Is this not our impression when we read Farida's account from the Middle East, mediated in Germany, and published in English? But Douglas's deconstruction of Rigoberta Menchu's narrative and the mediator's interventions put a check on this instinctive reaction. Whose narrative are we reading? Should sensitivity to the process of translation compel distrust in such accounts? Hoffman herself exacerbates the dilemma in an interview that she gave in 2016 with RNC Radio. She takes credit for writing the book, despite the fact that Khalaf's name, if you saw, Khalaf's name is written on the cover in large print above her own in small print. On the inside frontispiece, the authors are listed: Farida Khalaf, caps, and Andrea Hoffman, lower case. And while talking about the time she spent with Farida, Hoffman uses the third person in the way that scholars do when discussing interviewees for a book that they're writing. And in a Foyle's interview, so Hoffman is getting interviewed all over the place, Hoffman further inserts herself into Farida's narrative by claiming to have suffered with Farida for 4 months. So when the subtitle states, "This is my story," we have to ask why my and not her story. So we find ourselves torn between solidarity with the survivor and suspicion of the mediated autobiographical text. And we have to search in the spaces between the lines of that story for the truth that is not objective fact, but an auratic sense of the experience that exceeds the individual. Survivors of large-scale or traumatic events, writes Anna Douglas again, become by extension witnesses for those absent and unable to bear witness. The witness embodies the collective trauma, even when her words cannot reach us directly, but must be arranged and translated. It is a message and a method that apply to Farida and will, of course, to Nadia Murad. Like other witnesses to atrocities who do not speak an international language, Quechua, for example, Farida had to tell her trauma to an intermediary to get out of Yazidi Kurdish. In the process, the text risked acquiring what Anna Douglas dubs the Menchu effect. In the attempt to build a sense of solidarity with the witness, the politics of production and consumption of the text may be ignored in order to establish what she calls the witnessing effect, a concept that should be understood both in terms of the noun, an effect, and in terms of its rarer usage as a verb, to effect change. So, as readers, we have to try to move beyond the effect and be willing to suspend critical inquiry into the accuracy of the text in order to bear witness to the survivor who is testifying to the translator, and to hope that the story can effect political change. The value of a testimonial lies in its mere existence and in its enactment of the doubling effect of the witness. However, doubt lingers about truth-telling and possible exaggeration in order to attract the attention of an otherwise indifferent audience. I suggest that the truth of Farida Khalaf's story can be tested in a number of ways. First, the short time that elapsed between the event and telling mitigates the usual doubts about the reliability of memory over longer periods of time. Second, although Farida may have absorbed and narrated others' traumas as her own, her story is no less true, only less individual. And this may be better for a court of law. Khalaf writes, "There was only one thing we wanted now. We wanted to survive this nightmare and bear witness." Third, her version can be validated through comparison with others. Many media outlets have published interviews with Sabaya and their healthcare providers. They tell similar stories of sexual slavery. For example, on August 13th, 2015, a Yazidi woman told a New York Times reporter that the man who raped her, and I quote, kept telling me this is ibadah. He said that raping me is his prayer to God, unquote. So here, that was what Khalaf wrote. But the most powerful vindication of Farida Khalaf's story comes in a contemporary parallel account. It can be found in this year's Nobel Peace Laureate, Nadia Murad's book that was published last November, so it's 11 months old. The Last Girl, My Story of Captivity and My Fight Against the Islamic State. So, like Farida, Nadia Murad narrates her story to a reporter, Jana Krajewski, who does not include any text of her own, and her name does not appear on the book cover, only in the frontispiece.
Yeah, that's I see another very fashionable name on the cover.
Yes, well, I was going to talk very briefly about Amal Clooney. Amal Clooney, the very glamorous barrister from London, married, of course, to the film star George Clooney, took on the case in late 2016, And so she's been representing Nadia Murad successfully. So Nadia Murad with Jana Krzyzewski, we see this inside. In the first third of the book, Nadia's tone is distanced, as though describing something happening to someone else. So at a certain point, the captives are in a bus, and the Daesh men are beginning to grab the women's breasts and just generally being vile. And one of the captives starts to scream. And a Daesh thug snaps, and I quote from the book, "You have no choice. You're here to be Sabaya. You'll do exactly what we say." It was the first time that I'd heard the Arabic word applied to me. When Daesh took over Sinjar and began kidnapping Yazidis, they called their human spoils Sabaya, referring to the young women they would buy and sell as sex slaves. This was part of their plan for us. Written into the fatwas and pamphlets ISIS made official before they attacked Sinjar. We were no longer human beings, we were Sabaya. So it's interesting, they were very, very isolated, the Yazidis in the Sinjar community, and yet they had heard echoes of what Daesh was planning. So she says right early in the book, they were merchandise to be bought, sold, and sexually exploited. Like Farida Khalaf, Nadia Murad knows about their criminal fatwas. Throughout the book, the tone oscillating between numbness, terror, and fury, Murad uses the word sabiya and sabaya to refer to the girls in sexual bondage. She now knows, and I thought this was interesting, they mapped out the slave trade for months, determining what they thought was and was not legal under Islamic law. And they wrote it down so that all Islamic State members would follow the same brutal rules. Like the law of any state, confident that what they are doing is sanctioned by the Quran. I thought this was interesting because she's sort of understanding what that research and fatwas committee has done, that these men sort of think that they're following Quranic law. When she fantasizes at trial, as did Farida Khalaf, before the entire world, and I quote, like the Nazi leaders after World War II, her autobiography transforms into the Yazidi collective biography, or even a collective autobiography, as we were talking about before with Asya Jabbar. And she says, every Sabiya has a story like mine. You can't imagine the atrocities Daesh is capable of until you hear about them from your sisters. So again, this notion, I'm telling my story, but every time I'm telling my story, it's also the story of my sisters. Murad traces a transition that Douglas understands to be part of the process of survival from trauma. They stage the transition as a progression from, and I quote, witness as victim, to witness as survivor, to witness as performer. So, victim to survivor to performer, telling the tale of survival as a form of self-therapy and inspiration for others. In the next phase, Murad becomes, as we now know, the international celebrity advocate on behalf of the Yazidi community. Some international activists invited her to the UK to tell officials what had happened to me, she writes. I said yes, not knowing how much that one trip would change my life. It was the first time, she recalls, I would tell my story in front of a large audience. And she writes, I know now, and I thought this was very moving, I know now that I was born in the heart of the crimes committed against me, and I will use this story until those terrorists are put on trial. There's still so much that needs to be done. World leaders, and particularly Muslim religious leaders, need to stand up and protect the oppressed. International recognition seems to have influenced local perceptions, and I think this is so important. Something I didn't talk about, but that I know you're all familiar with, and that is that the rape victim, survivor, always runs the risk of being rejected by her community because of the stigma attached to the sexually violated body. And so this happened to many of the Yazidi women until Nadia Murad became famous. And Nadia Murad thanks Yazidi religious leaders for a dramatic change in local attitudes. Despite the stigma attaching to former Sabaya, these leaders declared that the women should, and she quotes, be welcomed back to society and not judged for what has happened to us. Because we had been raped, we were victims, not ruined women. This is something also I think is really important to think about, and that is that now that rape and war has been adjudicated a crime, a war crime, and a crime against humanity, the wound that a woman suffers as a result of rape becomes the equivalent of the physical wound of a gun. And further, in 2017, economist journalist Robert Guest discovered how influential these Yazidi religious authorities had been when he traveled to northwest Iraq to interview the Yazidis about Nadia Murad. To his surprise, he heard praise, not censure. And there's a long quote that I'm going to read. Nadia Murad, so one of the leaders says, Nadia Murad, I love her so much. I hope she becomes president of Iraq. And this was Kharb al-Khadir Mardos, a man who had fled from a village near Nadia's. And a Yazidi police chief called Aziz Haji Khalaf said, I think of her as a sister, an incredible person. I see her strength. With all that happened to her, she goes around the world and describes her suffering to get support for the Yazidis and to win freedom for the men and women who are still captives. And so economist journalist Guest goes on. He says, in dozens of interviews, I found only one old man willing to criticize her, and his complaint was speculative. He worried that she might one day go into politics and lose her ideals. So Daesh promises of social death for the Sabaya may fail. And if so, it will be due to the daring of these women to tell all. Every time Murad tells her story, she writes, I feel that I'm taking some power away from the terrorists. In August of 2017, she persuaded Iraq, and I quote, to let the Security Council appoint a panel of independent investigators to gather evidence of the most serious crimes committed by Daesh, and not just against the Yazidis. So over the past month, I've been talking about the emergence of a sense of identity in the person who is writing the autobiography. And as a result of the emergence of this self-identity, a responsibility. So what has been interesting is in this short time, she moves from being her own advocate to being the advocate of the Yazidi women in the camps, to advocate of all Yazidi women who had been raped, then of all Yazidi women, and then of all Yazidis, and now to all rape survivors. Her diplomatic shuttling back and forth between decision makers in Europe came to a head on September 21st, 2017. So with the help of her lawyer, Amal Clooney, she was able to persuade the UN Security Council to adopt Resolution 2379, put forward by the UK, to establish an international investigative team to work with Iraqi prosecutors and judges to collect disappearing evidence of genocide. And a few days ago, as you all know, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Should we expect some Menchu effects down the road? Probably. I hope not. Writing about the vital importance of life narratives for making human rights claims, Sheffer and Smith insist, and I quote, "Acts of remembering test the values that nations profess to live by against the actual experiences and perceptions of the storyteller as witness. They issue a call within and beyond UN protocols and mechanisms for institutions, communities, and individuals to respond to the story, to recognize the humanity of the teller and the justice of the claim, to take responsibility for the recognition, and to find means of redress." So this is beyond the suspicion that we were talking about earlier, that Anna Douglas was talking about. This is what matters. Yazidi women survivors have started to break the historical silence of rape victims, telling details previously too grim and shameful even only to be whispered. Women and men in the most precarious situations are disabling those who wish to deal them social death. Although men in all parts of the world at war still rape, and of course we had the horrendous stories coming out of Bangladesh of what's been happening to the Rohingyas, their actions are now more likely to be denounced, publicized, represented, and sometimes prosecuted. Wartime rape, some people say, has become a passion of international criminal tribunals. Hasn't done much good, but some people see it as a passion. And survivors are telling their stories to the world jury. Breaking the silence is crucially important. It has allowed Nadia Murad to close her book saying, and I quote, "I want to be the last girl in the world with a story like mine." Thank you.